Before diving into this incredible story, consider subscribing to the channel and hitting the bell. Every story here has something to say, and you won't want to miss a single one. Rain fell in fine drops on the streets of New York, transforming the sidewalks into dark mirrors reflecting the neon lights of the skyscrapers. In a dark corner of a narrow alley, a boy sat huddled under a coat too big for him. His matted hair and dirty face betrayed the years he spent surviving on the streets. His name was Ethan, and despite his young age, barely 14, he saw everything others believed was invisible. That evening, his piercing blue eyes stared at the entrance of a luxurious restaurant. A man in a suit stepped out, holding a bag filled with carefully wrapped groceries. His imposing gait and steady gaze revealed immense power. This man was Richard Sterling, a renowned billionaire, master of a technological and financial empire that seemed to touch every aspect of the city. At his side, Victoria Sterling, his wife, radiant in the streetlight, but something in her tight smile made Ethan shiver. The boy watched closely as the couple climbed into a black limousine, disappearing into the rainy night. Ethan instinctively knew that behind this luxury lurked an invisible danger, a secret no one suspected. He felt a shiver run down his spine. Since growing up on the streets, Ethan had learned to sense danger before it even struck. He had seen powerful men betrayed, alliances shattered, and lives shattered in seconds. Tonight, his instincts screamed that someone in this house was planning something terrible. And he knew he had to act. Because in a few hours, Richard Sterling's life could change. The black limousine pulled up in front of Richard Sterling's mansion. The headlights illuminated the wrought iron gate, gleaming in the rain. Victoria stepped out gracefully, a flawless smile on her face, while Richard carried a tray filled with exquisite dishes, carefully prepared for dinner. As he was about to enter, a small voice rose from the shadows. "Don't eat that. Your wife put poison in it." Richard jumped, almost knocking over the tray. He turned his head and saw a thin boy, his wet hair plastered to his dirty face, his eyes shining urgently. Who are you?" Richard asked incredulously. "Ethan," the boy answered, panting, his teeth clenched to hold back his fear. I've been watching you for weeks. Your wife, she doesn't just want your money, she wants you dead." Richard stood there, his heart pounding. A shiver ran down his spine. How could a street urchin know such a thing? He glanced at Victoria, who was laughing softly behind him, seemingly innocent. But something in his gut screamed at him to listen to her. "Okay, show me what you saw," he said finally, his voice firm but trembling with suspicion. Ethan gestured for him to follow. He led him through a back door, then up some hidden stairs to a small kitchen Victoria rarely used. Vials and bags lay on the counter. Ethan pointed. "Look at this, and this. She's been planning this for weeks. I don't know exactly what it is, but it doesn't smell good." Richard approached, examined the vials, and smelled a mixture of bitterness and chemical powder in the air. His heart raced. He realized then that this boy might have just saved his life. "Ethan, why me?" Richard asked. The boy shrugged, looking serious. "Because I see what no one wants to see. People like you, rich and powerful, they never think that someone small, invisible, can save them." Richard realized he had to act quickly. The life he thought was secure, protected by his wealth and power, was actually threatened by someone he had never suspected, his own wife. And he knew he couldn't trust anyone anymore, except this street boy. Richard quietly closed the kitchen door, his heart pounding. The vials and bags on the counter seemed almost harmless at first glance, but now he knew the weight of danger. Ethan, soaking wet and shivering, stood beside him, his eyes fixed on the rich man's every move. "You have to believe me," Ethan insisted. "If you taste what she made, you won't get away with it." Richard took a deep breath. He had always been the master of his world, controlling empires, billions of dollars, and yet here, facing a street boy, he felt incredibly vulnerable. "All right," he said finally. "Show me exactly what you saw." Ethan nodded and led them through a discreet passage behind the kitchen, to a small back door leading to a forgotten veranda. Through a half-open window, they could see Victoria. She seemed prepared, methodical, carefully placing powders and vials into small containers that she then hid in a secret cupboard. "How long has she been doing this?" Richard asked, his voice low. 4 weeks. Whenever you were busy elsewhere, Ethan paused, shaking his head. "I didn't see everything, but what I saw was enough to know she wants to eliminate you." Richard felt a cold shiver run down his spine. He knew his wife, thought he had known her for years, but now he doubted everything. "And why me?" he asked, more to himself than to Ethan. "Because I see what no one else sees. The rich think they're invisible, but it's invisible people like me who see everything," Ethan replied, his eyes serious. Richard thought for a moment. The police, his lawyers, his friends, no one would believe him if everything happened too quickly. He had to be careful, but he couldn't ignore what Ethan had just revealed to him. "We need to gather evidence," Richard whispered. "If I'm going into battle, I need to know exactly what she's planning." Ethan gave a small smile, a mixture of pride and relief. "I can help you. I know how to observe. I know when someone is lying, and your wife is lying." Richard felt the weight of the situation, but also a strange sense of relief. This boy, seemingly worthless to the world, had just become his most valuable asset. Together, they would thwart Victoria's plan. But one question haunted Richard: how far would his own wife be willing to go to get everything she wanted? And he knew that soon, he would have to find out. The rain had stopped, but the streets of New York remained damp and dark. Ethan and Richard had taken refuge in the billionaire's private office, a lavishly decorated room with shelves filled with antique books and windows overlooking the illuminated city. For the first time, Richard felt the weight of his vulnerability and realized how dependent he now was on a street boy. "All right, Ethan," Richard said, resting his hands on the solid wood desk. "If what you say is true, I have to act. But I can't just accuse her without proof. She's my wife." Ethan shrugged, his piercing gaze fixed on Richard. "What if she's your enemy? Would you rather die believing in the perfect marriage? Or live to discover the truth?" Richard took a deep breath. He knew the boy was right. Betrayal could come from anywhere, even from those he trusted most. "Okay," he said finally. "We'll work together. But we need a plan." Ethan gave a mischievous smile. "You have the means. I have the eye and the instinct. We complement each other." Over the next few days, they devised a strategy. Richard would continue to play the role of the trusting husband, letting Victoria believe she was still in control. Ethan, invisible as always, would monitor her every move, noting the smallest details: what dishes she prepared, which vials she handled, and with whom she secretly communicated. The unlikely bond between a street boy and a billionaire seemed fragile, but everyone knew their survival depended on it. One night, as they watched Victoria from a secret passage behind the living room, Ethan whispered, "Look, she's calling someone, maybe it's an accomplice." Richard narrowed his eyes. "I need to know who she's implicating. And fast." Ethan discreetly pointed to a notebook hidden under the couch, which Victoria always seemed to use to jot down instructions. "Every word counts. She thinks no one is watching. But I am." Richard felt a mixture of admiration and gratitude. He never imagined that a street boy could become his most valuable asset. Their alliance, though fragile and unlikely, was now the only thing that could save his life. And as night fell over New York, they both realized that the real game had just begun. The following days were a mixture of vigilance and constant tension. Richard continued to pretend to live a normal life, attending meetings and having dinner with Victoria as if nothing was wrong. But every move of the woman he thought he knew was now scrutinized by Ethan, lurking in the shadows like an invisible spectator. "Look at this," Ethan murmured one evening, pointing to the screen of a laptop they'd discreetly set up in Richard's office. "These wire transfers, she's moving money into accounts you don't know about. And that's not all, she's made contact with several people, shady guys, I'd say." Richard narrowed his eyes. "She's planning something big," and I bet it directly affects me. Ethan nodded seriously. Yes. And those late-night dates. I followed them once. She's meeting someone in an abandoned warehouse outside of town. I don't know exactly what they're doing, but it doesn't look good. Richard felt a mixture of anger and fear. Everything he thought he knew about his wife was crumbling. We need to know exactly what she's planning before we act, he said. The next evening, Ethan and Richard developed a more extensive surveillance plan. Ethan, agile and discreet, could enter and leave the house unnoticed. He watched Victoria when she thought she was alone, noting every gesture, every word, every suspicious contact. Richard, for his part, used his resources to check accounts, messages, and unknown movements. One night, as they watched Victoria through a half-open window, Ethan whispered, "Look, she's writing something in her notebook." Richard leaned forward and read over the boy's shoulder. Every word confirmed their worst fears. Victoria had hatched a plan to frame Richard for a fake financial scandal, isolate him, and seize his entire empire. "She'll destroy everything if we don't do something," Richard muttered, his face ashen. Ethan placed a hand on her arm, firm but reassuring. "We're going to stop her. But we have to be careful. She's cunning, she won't be caught easily." Richard took a deep breath. He understood then that the coming battle would not only be against Victoria, but against a whole network of invisible accomplices. And in that tense moment, he knew that his survival would depend entirely on this boy he had initially ignored. The hunt for evidence had just begun. A few days later, Richard decided to play a delicate role, that of the trusting and blind husband. Victoria, convinced that Richard was ignorant, appeared elegantly at a sumptuous dinner party in the manor's dining room. The chandeliers cast a golden light on the room, and the soft music barely masked the invisible tension in the air. Ethan, hidden behind a heavy curtain, watched Victoria's every move closely. He noted the dishes she prepared and the vials she discreetly handled. Every movement of her hand, every calculated smile, betrayed her intentions. Victoria approached with a particularly appetizing dessert, a delicate cake decorated with exotic fruits. "Richard, try what I've made. I'm sure you'll love it," she said with a smile that might have seemed genuine to anyone else. Richard took the dessert in hand, feigning surprise and enthusiasm. "Thank you, darling. It smells wonderful." At the same time, Ethan whispered, "Careful, she put something in it." Richard didn't move, but his gaze hardened. He knew he had to act with precision. When Victoria moved away to serve the rest of the guests, Richard made a subtle but decisive gesture. He discreetly switched his plate with that of one of the waiters, neutralizing the poison before anyone could fall victim. Victoria returned, a triumphant smile on her lips, convinced that her plan would succeed. But Richard, calm and imperturbable, looked her straight in the eyes. "You know, Victoria," he said softly, almost in a whisper, "there are things that we think are hidden, but are actually visible to those who know where to look." Victoria's smile flickered, a flicker of doubt crossing her eyes. Ethan, still hidden, felt his excitement rising. They had just won the first round. "You can't threaten me," Richard continued, his voice now firmer. "But I can watch you, and I can protect my life and my empire." Victoria, feigning indifference, walked away, but Richard knew he had just provoked a reaction. His wife had underestimated the street boy and the billionaire's vigilance. Ethan smiled slightly, his heart pounding. For the first time, they had managed to intercept a deadly move. But he knew this was only the beginning. Victoria was cunning, and their plan had to go further. Richard silently placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder. An unlikely alliance had been formed, the cunning of an invisible boy and the experience of a billionaire, working together to foil a deadly plot. The battle had just begun, and the field was now the perfect dinner. The day after dinner, Richard knew he had to act quickly. Victoria was not only cunning, she was methodical and prepared for anything. If Richard wanted to survive and protect his empire, he needed to obtain irrefutable proof of her intentions. "Ethan," he whispered in his private office, "it's time to dig deeper. We need to know exactly what she's planning and how she plans to execute it all." Ethan nodded, determined. I've already noticed that she keeps a notebook and some documents in her personal office. If we get them back, we'll know everything. That evening, the house was silent, Victoria busy in her quarters. Richard and Ethan slipped into the study, taking advantage of an opening in the security system that Richard knew better than anyone. Ethan quickly located the notebook carefully hidden in the secret desk drawer. Here it is, Ethan murmured, opening the notebook. Each page revealed detailed plans: how to frame Richard for a financial scandal, embezzle funds, manipulate witnesses, and flee with his accomplices. Richard quickly flipped through the documents, his face pale. She planned everything, every step, every person involved. Ethan added, and that's not all. I found clues about her outside contacts. She wouldn't be alone if something were to happen. Richard felt his anger rising, but he knew he had to remain calm. We need to document all of this. Photos, copies, every piece of evidence we can use against her. For hours they worked in silence. Ethan, agile and discreet, took photographs of the documents and noted important details. Richard, methodical, analyzed each plan and assessed the risks. We now have what we need to act, Richard said finally. But we must be careful. Victoria is not going to be taken in so easily. Ethan nodded. She thinks no one sees her. But we see everything. And soon, she'll realize she underestimated a street kid and a billionaire. Richard smiled, a mixture of gratitude and determination in his eyes. For the first time in weeks, he felt in control. With Ethan by his side, he knew they could take on Victoria and all her accomplices. But one thought lingered in his mind: Victoria would never give up without a fight. And the coming battle would be more dangerous than anything he had faced in his life. The next few days were spent meticulously preparing a trap. Richard and Ethan knew Victoria wouldn't just stand by. Her accomplices, secret transfers, and detailed notebooks showed she was prepared to do anything to seize Richard's empire. We have to catch her in the act, Richard said, scrutinizing the gathered documents and photos. But it has to be perfect. If she suspects anything, all is lost. Ethan, sitting on a rickety chair in the office, nodded. I can hide in the service passageways. I'll be able to observe everything she does and report every move. That evening, Richard feigned his usual routine. He pretended to be working late in his office, letting Victoria believe he was unaware of her plans. Ethan, invisible as always, slipped into secret passages, monitoring every move. Victoria, convinced that Richard suspected nothing, headed into the living room with a carefully concealed vial. She checked the laptop to ensure the secret transfers were in progress, then spoke to her accomplices by phone. Ethan whispered in Richard's ear, "They're here," she called her accomplices. "Everything's falling into place." Richard took a deep breath. This was a crucial moment. He had to remain calm, observant, and ready to act at the slightest sign of danger. As Victoria poured the contents of the vial into a glass intended for Richard, Ethan made a discreet gesture, signaling the threat. Richard intervened quickly, subtly switching glasses and intercepting the vial before it could cause any harm. Victoria, believing her plan was working, panicked when she realized Richard was staring at her. What are you doing?" she stammered, her face contorted with anguish. "I see everything, Victoria," Richard said calmly. "Every move, every shot, nothing escapes those who know how to observe." Ethan stepped out of the shadows then, staring at Victoria with an intensity that made her recoil. "You underestimated a street kid and a billionaire," he said coldly. "Now everyone will know what you're up to." The trap was a success. The accomplices, alerted by hidden cameras and the discreet intervention of security that Richard had warned, were arrested or neutralized. Victoria, helpless, realized that her meticulous plan had just been dismantled in a matter of minutes. Richard placed a firm hand on Ethan's shoulder. "Without you, none of this would have been possible." The street boy smiled. For the first time, he felt the power of his role in this dangerous game. And he knew that together, they were invincible, or at least, almost. News of the trap spread quickly through the manor. Victoria, humiliated and confused, realized that Richard and Ethan had anticipated her every move. She tried to remain calm, feigning indifference, but her hands were shaking slightly as she joined Richard in the living room. "Richard," she said in a soft, almost honeyed voice, I don't understand, how did you know?" Richard stood motionless, looking her straight in the eye. "I know everything, Victoria. Every transfer, every contact, every lie. You thought you could manipulate me and take what was mine." Ethan stepped out of the shadows and looked sharply at Victoria. "You thought no one saw. But we did. And now everyone will know." Victoria stepped back, distraught. Her accomplices, who had been caught in the act or neutralized, could no longer intervene. She realized that her empire of lies was crumbling before her eyes. "You have no idea what I can do," she whispered, trying to threaten Richard. "Oh yes," Richard replied calmly. "And I know your threats are nothing compared to the evidence we have." He showed the documents, photos, and recordings Ethan had compiled. "It's all there, every move, every plan." Victoria paled at the extent of what had been revealed. Her smile vanished, replaced by an expression of panic and suppressed rage. She knew she would not escape justice or the public exposure of her schemes. You can't do this," she stammered, her eyes filled with despair. Ethan stepped forward slightly, his voice cold but determined. "You underestimated a street kid and a billionaire. You thought money and power would be enough to protect you. But they're not." Richard took a step forward. "You are responsible for every action. And now it's time to answer for it." Victoria, unable to respond, collapsed on the sofa in defeat. She realized that her reign of manipulation and deception had come to an end. For Richard and Ethan, this moment wasn't just a victory against a deadly plot. It was proof that the unlikely alliance between a street kid and a billionaire could thwart even the most sinister plans. As Victoria was escorted out of the mansion by security forces and the evidence was secured, Richard placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder. "Without you, none of this would have been possible," he whispered. Ethan gave a small smile. "And without you, I would never have had the opportunity to show what I can do." For the first time in a long time, both felt invincible. But Richard knew the world was full of unseen dangers, and he had to remain vigilant. The battle had just ended, but the war to protect what was his and rebuild trust was far from over. Victoria Sterling was now under strict surveillance, and security forces escorted her out of the mansion. The documents and evidence Richard and Ethan had collected were handed over to her accomplices and the authorities, ensuring that justice would take its course. In the silence of the office, Richard sat heavily in his chair. He stared into space, still troubled by the betrayal of the woman he had loved and believed worthy of trust. Ethan, sitting across from him, watched him intently, his face serious but relaxed. "Richard," Ethan said softly, "are you okay?" Richard shook his head, a faint, wistful smile playing on his lips. "I think so, but I have to admit, I never thought I'd have to trust a street boy to save my life." Ethan shrugged. "I see what others don't. And I've survived on the streets long enough to know when someone's in danger." Richard leaned forward, placing a firm hand on the boy's shoulder. "You did more than save my life, Ethan. You saved my family, my empire, and maybe even my reason for being." Ethan looked down, a mixture of pride and humility on his face. I didn't know I was capable of this." Richard smiled. "You are. And I want to help you discover everything you're capable of." The billionaire then made a decision that would change the street boy's life forever. He offered Ethan a safe home, a well-rounded education, and the opportunity to learn alongside him, with the goal of developing his unique talents. "I don't want you to be just a guest in my house," Richard explained. "I want you to become my protégé. You have the eye, the insight, and the courage. With education and resources, you can go very far." Ethan looked around the mansion, a house that once symbolized unattainable luxury, and realized his life had just changed radically. "Thank you," he said finally, his voice trembling. I will not disappoint you. Richard smiled again. I don't doubt that for a second. But remember, Ethan, true power comes from knowledge and observation. You survived on the streets because you could see what others couldn't. Never lose that quality. Ethan nodded, understanding the essential lesson. His life on the streets, his daily survival, were not scars, but strengths. And now, with Richard by his side, he would learn to transform them into real power. For the first time, the street boy felt he belonged in a world where he could be seen and respected. But he also knew that vigilance must remain constant. The world was filled with unseen dangers, and he was no longer a mere spectator. The following weeks were a mixture of adaptation and discovery for Ethan. The street boy, accustomed to daily survival and the shadows of the alleys, now found himself in a world of luxury, knowledge, and infinite possibilities. Richard watched over him, but he gave him the freedom to learn, observe, and grow at his own pace. Ethan, Richard said one morning as they walked through the manor's vast gardens, you must remember one thing: money and power may protect your body, but never your mind. True strength comes from what you see, what you know, and what you do with that knowledge. Ethan nodded. I understand. I don't just want to be protected. I want to understand and take action. Richard smiled. Then you're exactly where you need to be. In the days that followed, Ethan began studying with mentors chosen by Richard, learning finance, strategy, and even the art of diplomacy and persuasion. But he always remained vigilant, his instincts honed by years spent on the streets. Every lesson, every encounter, every decision strengthened his mind and his ability to anticipate the moves of others. One evening, as they watched New York twinkle from the mansion's terrace, Ethan turned to Richard. You know, I never thought a boy like me could play such an important role in someone's life. Richard placed a hand on her shoulder. And yet, you have it. Because you saw what no one else saw, and you acted when necessary. You saved my life, my empire, and even my dignity. Ethan smiled, feeling for the first time that he belonged somewhere. But he also knew that his vigilance must remain intact. The world remained full of unseen dangers, betrayals, and secrets. However, this time, he was no longer alone. We're a team, Richard said, looking out at the bright horizon. An unlikely alliance, but a strong one. And together, we can take on anything. Ethan nodded. He had survived the streets, betrayals, and unseen dangers. Now he was entering a new world, armed with his intelligence, his courage, and a mentor who believed in him. And as the city lights stretched out before them, he knew his life had truly begun. A life where he could finally transform his past into strength, and his instincts into power. Because even in a world of wealth and luxury, he would always remain the boy who saw what others ignored, and who changed the course of things.